Okay, tonight there will be no public forum, no citizens' comment, and the only agenda item is the Wheat Ridge Planning Commission workshop. I will turn it over to Ms. Mikulak.
Thanks. Good evening. So tonight the purpose of our study session is to go over some sort of fundamental legal principles that relate to your job as planning commissioners. This is a public meeting, so it is recorded, so please do use your mics if there's any questions. It'll also serve as a resource. We have one vacancy on the commission, so they can watch it, one staff absence. And then anything that comes up that you feel like you need to refresh yourselves on over the duration of your term, you can. What I just passed around was a little outline that you can take notes on as we're going through. I'm going to cover the first two topics and hope that Ken or my colleagues jump in if I'm missing something. And then Mr. Dahl here is going to cover the balance of our topics. So we'll maybe jump right in. We try to do this training maybe once every year, every other year, so just to make sure that you're fresh on these relevant issues. What we added this time, if you've been through this training before, are the first two topics, which are sort of Planning and Zoning 101 and the role of the Planning Commission. So I'll just go over these pretty briefly, but generally speaking, the sort of fundamental part of what we do as a planning division and you as commissioners is to plan for the city. And so we have several guiding documents, and those are documents that typically would reflect a community's long-term vision, values, and would set policy priorities. And what's important to distinguish on those guiding documents from our zoning code is that the documents are advisory documents. They're vision documents. They're not enforceable. You can't say that somebody's breaking the law by doing something or a development that's contrary to the comprehensive plan. We certainly reference some of those documents when we do analysis of criteria that's in the code. But some of the types of documents that I'm talking about are the comp plan, updated last in 2009. We have 4 different sub-area plans, one for the TOD area, one for 38th, one for Wadsworth, one for Fruitdale, which is sort of the western side of 44th Avenue, and then a variety of other policy documents that aren't always under your purview. So there's a bike pedestrian master plan and a parks master plan, a housing diversification plan, the NRS document. So all of those sort of adopted documents, either formally as amendments to the comp plan or just adopted by you or council, are things that we're keeping in mind because theoretically, the zoning code, which is the regulatory and enforceable part, those rules should reflect the values of the community and should reflect those plans. So we want people to be involved in those planning processes because to the extent that those plans document values and priorities, we want our codes to then mimic that, so then our built environment mimics that as well and reflects the community's values. That's why every community theoretically has different values, different vision, different code, different rule book for development. So zoning, in this case, in Wheat Ridge is chapter 26, and zoning's used to basically ensure that the built environment mirrors those values. Zoning at a very basic level sort of answers 2 questions. What can I do and what can it look like? So can I have a garage in my backyard? Yes, no. Can it be metal? How tall can it be? How far from the property line? Can I have a grocery store on this commercial corridor? Yes, no. If so, what can it look like? It has to have this amount of masonry, this amount of windows, this is how tall it can be. So what can I do? What can it look like? That's essentially what that sort of 500, 800 pages is a rule book to answer those sort of 2 basic questions. And then the mapping component is the other part of zoning. So in Wheat Ridge, our zoning map right now I think shows like 27 different zones. And essentially each of those different zones has a different rule book. Code amendments occur over time, to ensure that our code is sort of evolving as our values and vision evolve. So for example, when the 2009 comp plan said we value urban agriculture, we did a code amendment that allowed produce stands and community gardens and farmers markets. So, codes are not meant to be stationary. Craft brewing wasn't a thing 20 years ago, so we went through code amendment to say we value that, we want to be open for business. The development of mixed-use zone districts is also something that came out of our comprehensive plan. And I want to talk a little bit about the difference between plan developments and mixed-use zoning, because those are sort of the 2 predominant zone change applications that you see. historically, so we incorporated it in 1969, first planning commission, 1969. We inherited the zoning map from the county. So we talk a lot about why our zoning map looks like a patchwork quilt. That's part of the reason. But historically on that map, there's a lot of plan development designations, and that's because we predominantly relied on a plan development as your only zone change option. And we still do with certain criteria, over an acre for residential, things like that. But a plan development is a property-specific zoning code. So we have our huge zoning code, we have 27 different zone districts, and then we have hundreds of property-specific zoning documents, the plan development. And it's great for a project that's maybe unique or has a weird topography or a funky shape or just a cool idea that doesn't fit into our code. But it's time-consuming, it's a long process, and there's no predictable outcome. And our last comprehensive plan said we need to be a little bit more predictable and consistent and have another option. And so that's when we created the mixed use codes, because the comp plan said we needed to do that. And with the mixed use codes, there is a very specific rule book. So it's Article 11 in Chapter 26. And whenever anyone says we're thinking about mixed use, we give them these 50 pages and say, if you can play by these rules, then mixed use may be a good option for you. It's very prescriptive. There's almost no room for variances, very detailed standards in terms of building form. So how tall, how high, architectural standards, things like that. And really the mixed use and the plan development codes are intended to serve two different functions. And we use them and recommend them sort of almost equally depending on what somebody might come to us and request. Let's see. Anything else on mixed use? The other handout that I just gave you is the blue boxes, is an extremely simplified visual explanation of all of the development review that we do. So you see a wide range of different development applications, and I tried to think about how do you simplify 2-inch binder of code into a very single flow chart. So all of our review processes really respond to 4 questions, and we go through them sort of one at a time. So the very first thing we're asking, right, zoning is it allowed and what can it look like? So the first question is the use permitted, right, if somebody's coming to us? And the answer may be yes. We look at our use charts. It may be no, and in that case, we say, okay, should we rezone you, or just no? We say no to a lot of people who have a lot of ideas that just don't make sense, either from the code or from what we know our council priorities or the comp plan, or maybe, and that's where we have a special use or conditional use option. The only time we have neighborhood meetings for any of our processes are when it's use related. So a zone change always requires a neighborhood meeting, and a special use permit requires a neighborhood meeting. But once you know that the use is permitted and it's a property right, then we go to the next question, which is the land developable? And by that, it could mean, are the lots configured appropriately? Does it have street access? Does it have utility access? Can you construct on there what you are permitted to construct on there? And if the answer is yes, then that's great. And if it's not, that's when you'd see a subdivision application. We have a few different types of plats. Some are reviewed by staff, some are reviewed by planning commission, and some then also are elevated to go to city council. Then the third question, if you've got the use and you've got the land appropriately developed, then are you changing any buildings on the site? Are you adding new buildings to the site? Is something physically happening? And if the answer is yes, then we're doing a site plan review. Sometimes those are administrative, depending on the zoning. Again, with mixed use, if you're following this very specific rule book, part of the reason we created that was to save some time and be predictable. So if somebody's saying, yes, I can commit to those rules, then they can be reviewed administratively, and we just confirm that they're meeting all those rules. If it's a plan development, that's the specific development plan, SDP review, that comes to the Planning Commission. And then the fourth question, does the site design or the building design comply with the standards? And if the answer is no there, that's when we're looking at a variance. Sometimes you would see a variance if it's attached to like an SDP, but usually those would either be staff or the Board of Adjustment. And all of those bold things on the right-hand side are essentially all of the processes we have. You just saw a master sign plan. We'd lump that into sort of that site plan SDP. But everything we do is essentially answering those 4 questions. In terms of the role of the Planning Commission, which is the next topic I'm going to cover before I turn it over, we've had some good conversations just amongst us and our staff and with some of you of sort of, what is the role, what are we supposed to do? Sometimes you are the end, you're the deciding authority, but not always. You're more often than not making a recommendation to council, and they sometimes agree with you and they sometimes don't. You sometimes agree with us and you sometimes don't. And so it can sometimes cause the question of like, well, what's the point, right? Why am I here? And historically, planning commissions have been around in this country, for over 100 years. And the purpose is really to depoliticize some of these decisions that relate to the long-term development of a community. So there's good reason that you're appointed and not elected officials, specifically to remove that political implication and tension, right? Council has a different vision and sort of lens through which they need to look at the city and their decisions than you. So you're compelled to review from the basis of the code and the comp plans, and we'll talk about some of that as we proceed tonight. The first planning commission here in Wheat Ridge was established as soon as we were incorporated in 1969 because it's a very important role. And there's sort of three different roles that you serve. So planning, participating in those long-range guiding documents, the creation of those. We would expect that we have some of that coming up in the next few years. In that way, you're part of that process and you're in an advisory capacity to council, recommending the adoption of long-range planning documents. You serve in sort of you wear a legislative hat sometimes, and that means that you're, again, in an advisory capacity to council on how the code, the laws, should change related to the development code. So whether it's setbacks or animal daycare or subdivision regulations, you will always make a recommendation on any code change that affects Chapter 26. And those can be discretionary. So you're bringing in your opinions. You can talk about those. We'll talk a little bit about this later. Bring in your expertise, do your homework, those kinds of things. The last component and sort of the bulk of what our training will be and why Mr. Dahl is here is your role in a quasi-judicial function. And that's still often advisory. Sometimes you're the decision maker, like for a specific development plan or for a minor subdivision. But that's when you are reviewing something that is property specific versus the citywide code amendment. A lot of I would say in recent years, the majority of your cases have been property specific on land use or development decisions. And in that role as a judge, there are sort of very important rules to follow. That's probably my best segue to you.
That's great, good segue.
And I should say, if there are questions, do feel free to interrupt, or if you have any questions on what I just said, we can pause for a moment. I think we had committed earlier, we think we can get all this done in 2 hours, but we want to make sure you feel like you understand the content, and if you have questions, please use your mic, but feel free to interrupt. Sure. You use your mic. Thanks.
Oh, I have such a big mouth. Is council always the last say?
Not always. So the code dictates sort of who approves what. So if, for example, for subdivision plats, there are some, we consider plats to be a ministerial action. There's not criteria for review. It's a technical document. So there are some that staff reviews. There are some that planning commission reviews. So for a minor subdivision plat, you would be the only reviewing authority. Your decision can be appealed to council. But in that case, you'd be the final decision maker and a specific development plan. If it's going separate from the zone change, you're the final decision maker. Anything else before we charge on to the next page?
Okay, let's charge on. Well, thanks for having me very much, and I surely appreciate working not only with you but with your staff. And one point that I want to make is that you're not paid to come here and do this, and I think you get a lot of grief when you're sitting over the dais, and that's your job. And but what I want to do is take the opportunity to thank you for volunteering your time, because as staff we are paid to do our jobs. We're glad to do them. We're proud of the jobs we do, and it is our work. But you take time off from your families, and on Thursday nights when whatever's going on, you're not there, and you're here instead. And that's a huge commitment to the community. And my whole career, I have remained in awe of the amount of time and effort and energy that people like you give for free every other week you're in. And then you've got to read that really long packet, and then you've got to try to work your way, Vivian, through that 2 inches of code, you know, and so it's something I want to thank you for, and I want to make sure you heard that. Lauren is right. You have these various roles, one of which is legislative, and you review changes to Chapter 26. Or any ordinances changing Chapter 26 have to go to the Planning Commission first, and you review those and you make recommendations. The most recent one I can remember, there's probably something more recent, but it was quite a long hearing, and that was the construction defects ordinance. And Scott over here, you know, tortured me unmercifully in this very room, asking me, now, you've written this, and what's it, you know, are you sure about that? But it prepared me quite well, and I think it prepared the council well when we went to the council hearing, because, and it's a good example of the function of the Planning Commission, you had really kind of vetted that ordinance, and you had surfaced issues and surfaced questions that had we not had the review and recommendation from Planning Commission, we would have been less prepared for the council action on it, and the net product would not have been as good. And that's why, you know, it's a good example of what you do legislatively. Now we'll talk about what you do when you're wearing your quasi-judicial hat. And as Lauren said, that's when you're acting on an individual piece of property. And you're saying yes or no, or recommending yes or no to subdivision, to zoning on a specific piece of property. And so then you're wearing your quasi-judicial hat. So you're not pure judges, but you're quasi-judges. So you'll see as we go through it, you need to act, especially in your relationship with the applicant and the public, more like a judge would act. And before I go into the outline, so for example, if I sell my car, my 1993 Acura that I'm very proud of, with all those miles on it, to Ken, and he alleges that it's a lemon, which it probably is by now at 600,000 miles, but fine, he alleges that. And Lauren, well, let's make Scott the judge. If we were to see Ken taking Scott out to lunch before the trial, all of us would say, can't do that, because Ken's taking Scott out to lunch to lobby him about how this is a lemon and that your contract should be set aside. You're in the same position. That's not always fully appreciated by those that come in front of you, but that is your role. And if you sort of remember that, that informs a lot of the rules that you're undertaking. And I'll go through the rules, but I'll also give you, hopefully, pointers for how you can articulate those rules to your constituents who don't make that distinction between the legislative function on construction defects. Anyone could have lobbied Scott as much as they wanted before the hearing on construction defects ordinance. That's an ordinance that affects the whole city. It's not property specific, it's not quasi-judicial, it's legislative. And so what I'll try to do is give you pointers for how to articulate that to the people that will still come to you because they expect to be able to come to you and lean on you, and how you can kind of articulate your role to them so that we end up with a fair process and one that is defensible in the end. So what is the quasi-judicial standard? The things that I'm on the outline now, actions you take on zoning, variances sometimes are paired with a zoning action. Sometimes you'll see those together and you'll act on them rather than the Board of Adjustment. Our code requires that where they're paired, you are the body that says yes, no to the variance as opposed to the Board of Adjustment. And the consequences of quasi-judicial are several. Notice and hearing. That's why we send out notices, we post notices, and we have a public hearing. That's required. The right to present witnesses and evidence, and that's both the applicant's right and opponent's right and the members of the public. The right to make legal argument. We don't have a lot of that here at this level, but every now and again you'll have lawyers that will come in and argue for their applicant's position, and they have the right to do that. They'd have the right in a trial, wouldn't they? Let's remember that lawsuit between me and Ken in front of Scott. You know, you can have lawyers there if you really feel you need them. Two last things, no ex parte contacts and right to an impartial decision maker. I want to spend a little more time on it. It's in outline. No ex parte contacts. That's Ken taking Scott to lunch. That's a contact that Ken is having with the court outside of the public hearing, because I'm not there. My witnesses aren't there. If this were a rezoning hearing, for example, the public isn't there. The applicant isn't there. When someone traps you in the vegetable aisle and says, you know, there's this rezoning coming up on the agenda, and here's how I feel about it. It's not their fault that they asked you that. Their job as citizens is to access you and not to be aware of these rules, but it's your job as the quasi-judge to be aware of them and to apply them, and you will get those questions. So it's a contact outside of the hearing that you will have. And you will get a little list, if you all do get these little lists, right, of the current quasi-judicial, current pending quasi-judicial matters, where they are, who the applicant is, et cetera, so that you're able to know whether something has come in and now it's a live application and the quasi-judicial curtain falls then, and you've got to make sure that going forward on that application, you wait until the hearing to take and hear public testimony. That's the rule. Why should the contacts be avoided? To the extent you have those contacts, they're going to have to get disclosed on the record, and a lengthy contact will result in you having to step down and recuse yourself from acting on the case. And the case law is really pretty clear on that. If you've got contacts such that they can't be easily disclosed on the record, then you're not able to participate. And that doesn't do anyone any good, most especially the people that came and talked to you and wanted to kind of influence you before you showed up at the hearing. Well, how can you do that? I live in the real world. As you know, I'm from unincorporated Adams County, and it doesn't get any more real, than that. And so I know that in a small community, and Wheat Ridge isn't that big, you're going to get people that are going to approach you and with the purest of intentions want to just give you their opinions about this upcoming case that's scheduled for a public hearing. How can you avoid that? Well, there's sort of 4 doors, At first, you have to wait until you find out what it is. You can't really tell someone, you can't listen to them on that matter until they tell you what it's about. And that doesn't bother me. That's an ex parte contact, but you can't not talk to people in the store. But when it's been identified that, it's that rezoning matter, then you say, I have to tell you that you can do the legal reason first. That's a quasi-judicial matter, and I can only take the testimony, I can only hear testimony in the hearing room, and it's improper to do it outside of the hearing room. Sometimes people will understand that, other times they won't. The second door is to say, I'm sorry, I can't listen to you because if I did, I wouldn't be able to participate. That appeals to their self-interest because the reason they're talking to you is to influence your vote. And so you say, that will, I don't want to be kicked off of the commission because of this. So you urge them to show up, to come to the hearing and bring that information to the hearing. Door number 4 or 3 is, if they're not really buying it, I don't fully understand it, but the city attorney says I can't. That's sort of your mother says or your father. Use me in any way you like, because to me it's all about the outcome, the result, which is that you don't have the contact. And you do it and you refuse the contact in as polite a way as you can. That's really the twofold goal here. Door number 4 is, I'm sorry, I'd love to talk to you, but I hear my wife calling me from the next aisle over and I have to go. Those are some tools. You can probably think of others yourself. Be polite, but emphasize that the hearing is the hearing. The hearing isn't taking place in the vegetable aisle with just you, because who's missing? The staff is missing. The applicant is missing. All the people that are going to sign up and come and testify are missing. None of them are there to hear what it is that is being told to you as one of the judges, and it's their rights that we're protecting here. Vivian, did you have a question?
I do. The email that we get that lists the pending quasi-judicial caseload report, you almost have to put anybody off that wants to talk to you about anything and go check to see if it's on the report before you, or you just don't talk to anybody because it may be, I don't have it memorized. And so it's either under staff review or public hearing pending or to be determined as far as a date. So when does this start and when
That's
does
a-
this end?
That's the right question. I get that question in a lot of jurisdictions, and different city attorneys probably have different lines, but mine's a bright line test. When the application has come into the city and has been stamped received, then it's a pending case. I get it, that before an application's come in, oh gosh, the property at, 38th and Wadsworth way back when, sat there empty just for, a really long time with weeds growing in it, and there was no pending application, and people, I get it that the conversations about that were fine. But once the application's been stamped received, that's when it's a live case, and that's when the rule applies.
And that can be a really long time.
Yeah.
So there are, especially plan development, it can take 12 to 15 months for something from the day it's received to us, from the day it comes to you. So you'll see things on there sometimes for a really long time, and that means you can't talk about it for, that entire duration of time.
And, beyond just the ex parte aspect of it, we're going to get to the right to an impartial decision maker here in a minute, because the more you're sort of hearing about something, the more you're forming an opinion. And it's your job to form an opinion when you're sitting up here in the end, but you need to inform that opinion based upon a hearing where it's all presented and everyone's here in the same room with kind of the same level of rights. And that's why the sort of series of conversations that are individual detract from your job and your role and the effectiveness of that role as a group, because you can only act as a group. You're not independent hearing officers. You act only as a group. What happens when the inevitable happens? People, rattle on for a while, and it takes a while for you to figure it out, or you're being polite. Again, I live in the real world, and my mother taught me to never interrupt. So it puts me at a real disadvantage, with people that do and that don't give you any room to stop them to say, wait a minute. My rule has always been, and you've seen me exercise it at city council primarily, where council members will say at the beginning of a hearing, I need to disclose that so-and-so came to me and said X, Y, Z. I told them that I couldn't have the conversation and urged them to come. Doesn't matter if they came or not. What you're doing is you're telling the rest of the body exactly what happened. But that's a Band-Aid that only covers kind of small cuts. If you had lunch and talk extensively about the project, you're not going to be able to sit up here and do that disclosure with any kind of effectiveness, and frankly, it's going to derail the hearing and make the hearing all about your lunch. So in that case, you're going to have to step down. But I get it that there are the occasional contacts you will get, and what I've always advised is that you get a hold of the chair ahead of the hearing, and you say, at the beginning of the hearing, can you recognize me because I need to make this disclosure? And it's pretty, it's a short disclosure is going to be fine. But if you had the lunch, you're going to need to step down because you were here at this hearing or this work session. That's the consequence of having the lunch. Well, it used to be I'd tell people, what about letters? No one gets letters anymore at all. We get emails. So the same rule applies to the emails, letters, other contacts that you will get. And the way to deal with that is to share them with the staff. You've probably seen that in your packets occasionally, where there will be emails that are come to, say, to Scott. He'll give that to the staff. That gets reproduced. It's in your packet or it's at the dais. That now everyone's on the same page. You can't turn off your email, and I'm not asking you to. You're welcome to receive those things, share them with the staff so that everyone has them. That's kind of the short course on ex parte contacts. I've told you at the bottom what to do. If they've occurred, make a disclosure. Talk to Scott ahead of time. Remember, no surprises. So, Scott now knows, okay, when I get to agenda item number 4, I'm going to need to recognize Richard. And he's going to say he had this conversation, and he told the person to show up. And I think what that also does is helps to inform the public, oh, that's the rule. And I think that's really important. I don't want this to be a secret to the public, and they're always wondering why they can't talk. I'm fine with that. In fact, I use that as a teaching tool. So that's ex parte contacts. it is, something you'll see and you'll have to resist pretty regularly and frequently. And that's a hard part of your job, and I'm sorry. I'd like to make it easier. I've tried to give you techniques to make it as easy as possible without, short of you not doing your job. And sometimes, a job comes with some constraints, and that is one of them, I'm afraid.
Let me answer your question very directly. If it's on the list, it's an official application. So we don't put it on the list until it's an official application.
Very good.
And then if I could ask if we can follow through with that, maybe you want to answer it at a different time. So once we have voted on planning commission, it's still quasi-judicial until it goes to city council if that's the next step?
That's a really good question. That's a very informed question for the rest of you, because a lot of people don't sort of think that through. My rule is if there's no chance that it's coming back to you, then you're done. Because you think when you're voting, I'm done. What I always advise is that while it rarely happens, council does have the right to re-refer back to planning commission. It's rarely happened, but when it does, it's back in front of you for some reason. And for that reason, my rule is wait until after the council meeting so that you know that it's done before you're able to have more conversations. Now, I'm admitting that it's rare for it to be re-referred to you, but that has happened, and the council has the right to do that. So it's still a live application, not in front of you, but it might be. That's why, I'm a lawyer. I exercise, I'm more conservative with respect to following the rule in that way. No one has to now explain why, well, there are a lot of conversations because we thought it wasn't coming back. Now what do we do? And then we've got a lot trickier record to try to make, and I'd rather not have to do that. Right, yeah. Mm-hmm.
One other thing is, I think for ex parte, I think this is all ex parte, but the point is to keep the entire commission informed on every conversation that's going on about the application. If you start having offhand conversations even between yourselves, you have to be careful. Is that correct? Like 2 or more creates an issue.
Because you're deliberating on the application. And when do we deliberate? Up here.
Right.
In a noticed public meeting when the public can come and see what you're saying to each other. I'm glad you asked the question because we all recognize that conversation between the lunch between Ken and Scott, and thank you very much for allowing yourselves to be used. I'm going to keep doing it. We all, agree that's not right. That's trying to influence the judge. As you're having conversations amongst each other, what you're doing is doing the deliberation that the public and the applicant and the opponents all have a right to see you do in the light of day up there. Because when you're on the phone with another commission member, no one sees that. It's not fair. It's transparency that we owe the public that we're required to give. And so while it means that you kind of got to wait until the big night, that comes with the territory. Speaking of waiting until the big night, that brings us to this right to an impartial decision maker. Kind of like judges, you shouldn't decide the case before you hear the evidence. Again, living in the real world, we're all aware of that intersection. We've all been waiting for this application to come in. We knew it would. We've got opinions about that property. Of course we do. But it's important to say, okay, I've got opinions. I'm going to keep them to myself. I'm going to maintain an open mind until I've heard the public hearing. And I think I know a lot about this city because I've been here doing this work for a long time, and I think when an application comes in, I know all about that. I go to the hearing here, and inevitably, every single time, I learn something new. I see the application in a different way. I had not understood that XYZ was happening next door or across or did, and inevitably I say, my initial idea or impulse on this wasn't completely accurate. It might have been partly accurate, but that's another reason to wait, and you're required to wait to make your decision. Letter B is something I really want to emphasize. I will see especially new members of a council or of a commission. It's happened throughout my practice. The hearing has just started. you know, you're into the first of 10 witnesses. And it's clear from the questions being asked by the member that they're voting no. And sometimes they'll say, well, I'm against this because X, Y, Z. The hearing hasn't been completed yet. You know, if the judge here, halfway through the first witness on my car, and I'm about to call my mechanic to say why it's such a great car, we haven't even heard from the mechanic yet, and the judge says, well, this car's a lemon, and I know where I'm headed on this. Everyone would feel that was really unfair, wouldn't they? Of course, you haven't seen the car, but still. So don't signal where you're coming from. I get it, and again, real world, you've got an opinion. Keep it to yourself until it's time to vote or to have a motion and then discussion. And again, in terms of what the public thinks about, well, why am I bothering to come to this hearing? She's already made up her mind. What's the point? Think about how it looks out here. I spend all my time not at the dais when I'm in council meetings. I spend all my time out of the staff table or in smaller communities that I represent. I'm sitting out in the audience. And it's a huge difference. I advise you all to go to somebody else's hearing sometime. Go to Arvada, go to North Glen, go to Westminster, anybody's hearing. Sit in the audience and just get a sense of how it feels to be out there. And that will inform a number of the things I'm going to tell you in terms of delivering a fair hearing to people. You're never going to please everyone in the room because you're going to have to vote one way or another. But the hearing needs to not only appear fair, but to be fair. And that includes an impartial decision maker. So don't decide ahead of time. Don't signal your opinion ahead of time. And if there's other meetings going on, and we have other meetings in the city, you're wearing a different hat now. And don't go to those meetings because, among other things, you'll get, it's a rich territory for ex parte contacts. You know, you're kind of like embracing it. And it's a setting in which you're going to end up finding that you're making your mind up ahead of time. Yeah, Scott.
So I have one quick story I want to share. I won't name the municipality, but I was working on a project at a municipality, and apparently what had happened, and this is all, nothing's on the record necessarily, but what had happened was that one of the planning commissioners had her husband contact the developer to ask questions about stuff. And so okay, and they even brought it out in the planning commission and said that, and I thought, like, she has to recuse herself. She's already made a decision. She ended up voting no. The project passed anyway, but I was really insulted that planning commissioner had done that, had asked her husband to gain other insights of information on this particular project.
I appreciate that. In fact, that is a good segue to the top of page 3. And it's the sort of separate research question, you know. I've got the time. I want to dig a little deeper. You've got you'll have a staff report, you'll have the code. That's a lot of material. To the extent you feel you need additional material or you have questions, that's when you ask staff. And to the extent it needs to be, your staff report needs to be supplemented or there's additional information to be provided, the staff will provide it to everyone so that we don't have we show up at the hearing, Commissioner X says, well, besides what's in the record, I did some additional research and I went out and I talked to adjacent property owners, I went out and did this or that. You know, you're the judge, you're not one of the witnesses, and you're not the applicant, you're not the opponents. I get it that if you have questions as you're reviewing an application and want to direct those to staff for the hearing, that's their job. And I think hopefully Ken and Lauren will agree that they're there for you and they're there to provide information for you, but they'll provide it then to everyone because, again, it's a little like the ex parte email you got. It goes to everyone. Did you have a question?
Yeah, to go back to the bottom of page 2, letter C.
Attending other meetings on the
Yeah,
application.
just a moment ago, we talked about how the decisions we make oftentimes aren't final until the city council passes on them and doesn't send them back. So does not attending meetings go forward in time too?
That's my recommendation. I occasionally see a planning commission member that, you know, you're really interested in this. I want to go to the council meeting, kind of see what happens. I think I advise against that. Again, it's rare that it gets re-referred, but if you're at the council meeting and the other planning commission members aren't, it's re-referred. Now you have a different set of information than they do. And I realize it sounds a little artificial, well, these are all public meetings, but what I'm trying to do is keep all of you judges on exactly the same level, with the same background, the same level of information that you got all in the same place publicly. And that's why I would wait. Your lives are full with the work that you're going to get, and if you really are dying to go to a council meeting, go to Westminster council meeting and watch them. And, you know, I mean, honestly, and I'm a little bit of a meeting groupie. I represent 4 cities. I'm always in a council meeting, but you know, it's interesting to me, especially from a procedural standpoint. We think that we know what we're doing here is the only way to do it, and you go somewhere else, as Scott's aware, and there's a completely different process, but that we never would have thought of, but it works. It's something I'm going to recommend as we get a little further into the outline. Want to talk about public hearings?
Can I do 2 quick
Sure,
things on
yep.
research? So if you want additional research on something, ask us the question. Inevitably, if you've asked us the question, you're not the only one that wants the additional research, and we'll either, again, supplement the staff report or add something into our presentation at the hearing. So if you're wondering it, somebody else probably is. So again, you can come to us. It's not ex parte contact to contact staff, ever. It's also appropriate to do a drive-by and to visually set eyes on the subject property. Everything looks different in person. That's not additional research. Just don't get out of the car. Don't invite, you know, conversation with the property owner or a neighbor. Try to keep it as much of a drive-by as possible.
I had a site visit once, that's why I don't recommend site visits anymore. I had a site visit once in Silverthorne, and the applicant, and we brought the whole commission, and we published it, but, you know, it's kind of hard to have the public out there in the middle of a field to begin with, and the engineer for the project was there just to unlock the gate. That was his job. And I said, now, Gray, his name was Gray, you're just unlocking the gate, right? Because we don't have the whole public here. This is just a site visit commission, not going to be doing deliberation. We're just going to walk around. And he promised, and he just could not resist. So we're walking. I said, now, you have to understand, here, the boundary, you know, the site boundary of the property is here, so the landscaping will go here. And, you know, now we're conducting a hearing, and who isn't there? The public, opponents. And I said, great, we talked about this. And so, yeah, I know. 5 minutes later, he's doing it again. And because and in his mind, he was trying to help. He was just giving information. Fine if you're at the hearing. So I had to terminate the site visit early, and we all went home. Because I knew I couldn't trust him to just, you know, keep it closed up. I'm very much a fan, though, of the drive-by site visit. Drive by in your car and get it and figure out, oh yeah, the tree's there. Oh, the land really does drop off more severely than it looks like on the plan view. And that's fine. Well, let's talk about public hearings, because they all happen in here, and it's one of the products that we produce. As government, we produce public hearings for people, and it's their opportunity to come and see us work and to provide testimony. What's the goal? That everybody feels that it was a fair hearing and their views were heard and appreciated, or heard and understood. Not that we win, because there's always someone that doesn't. In my experience, people are fine, well, they're not fine with losing, but they're better, they will accept not being on the winning side of something if they feel that they were heard. And so a lot of this is about making certain that people are heard. So how do we do that? We have to have rules. It's not New England town government where everyone is, everyone's got unlimited time. You have to have some kind of structure. So whatever the rules are, you announce them at the beginning and you stick to them. This is largely the function of the chair, but sometimes individual members have to step up. If you've got a large number signed up, it's absolutely fine to do the math at the beginning and assign an amount of time, and then stick with that rule all the way through. That's perfectly fine. You can do that on an application by application basis. Maybe there weren't restrictions, but now it's 11 o'clock at night and you've still got 20 people on the next application. You're allowed to make judgments about what the rules are for that application. You always suggest the speakers not repeat prior testimony. You count on prior testimony getting repeated, and you get the brass bottom award and you sit there and you listen. You don't be impatient by virtue of the fact that this is the third time you've heard that argument. And let me tell you why that is. Years ago, I used to be more impatient, I guess, lack of a better way of saying, oh, come on. It's the third person, the 10th person that said that very same thing. Why is that? It's a different person is why. And that person, maybe they're saying the same thing as the 3 prior speakers, but they spent an hour at home figuring out how to say that and planned on coming and taking their 3 minutes to say that to you. And it's hugely important to them. And because it's hugely important to them, it should be important to you. And I get it that you've heard it already, you've sat up there a lot more times than they have. This may be their only time they're ever going to be in this room. So their impression of Wheat Ridge City government is all about how you treat them. And you'll notice I'm passionate about that, because if we're going to say yes to this job, it comes with, listening to each person with the equal amount of respect, even though this is the third time you've heard that. It's the first time for them, and so it's important. And so I really want to emphasize that. I always do. I've done that. I've said that for years, and I really believe in it. So you ask them not to repeat prior testimony, but be ready for them to do that, and I think there's value to that. And value because maybe now there's 10 people saying that, and they believe, and I think they're right, that should have an impact on you. That's another reason you're listening patiently. The public testimony has to be directed to the commission. This isn't a Q&A because you're the ones making the decision, and the chair is usually pretty good about that. Make sure everyone knows they've got the right to speak. The mayor here is very good. After he's gone through the sign-up sheet, he'll say, is there anyone else? Often there is, and that's good, because sometimes people don't think about that. I remember, we're on TV. It was, 20 years ago, and it was a controversial annexation hearing, and it went on quite late. And toward the end of the hearing, people started showing up because they were watching it on TV. And so they came, and I thought that was great. We talk about, inclusion. That was terrific as far as I was concerned. The last 2 points I want to make are important. Give the witnesses your full attention. I was a lobbyist for the Colorado Municipal League for 6 years, and so I spent a lot of time in committee hearings. And one of the things that amazed me was legislators reading the paper at the committee table while witnesses were testifying. Amazing. These are people that drove in from Swink, and they drove in from Lamar. And again, this is like, they spent a lot of time preparing their 3 minutes, and their representative isn't listening and is reading the paper, or is nowadays looking on the cell phone. I couldn't believe that. Now, they would do that when the lobbyist for CML, would testify, and that didn't really offend me that much because they'd seen me a million times. They knew what CML's position on the thing was. And when you're the professional lobbyist there, you cut each other a little more slack. But for the residents that had come in from all over the state, I think it's absolutely unacceptable, including having side conversations with the commissioner next to you. As far as you're concerned, you're not being polite, you're kind of listening. But again, go to a Westminster meeting and sit and watch. And you'll find yourself irritated at Councilmember X talking to Councilmember Y up there on the dais while someone's trying to testify. That's giving the speakers your full attention, because that's what you signed up for. So if you didn't want to sit and listen to the testimony, then don't sign up and don't get appointed. But Melissa, you had a question.
This came up at our last meeting. Sometimes the public poses a question to the commission and our ability to address it versus not being able to respond to it.
You'll see what the mayor does. I haven't been in that many planning commission meetings here lately. I think the better way because the minute you start answering those questions, now you're starting a dialogue that's going to have to get repeated. Now that's, quote, the rule that's true throughout. What I think the chair needs to do, and the mayor's pretty good at that, is to say, we're not going to answer that question directly but right now, but we're going to ask the staff and the applicant to make note of that, and there will be an opportunity after the public testimony to respond to that. It's important not to get into the back and forth because that you're going to derail the whole hearing, number one, but secondly, it's important to honor the question. They had a question, it's just now's not the time, and Commissioner X isn't the time to answer it, or sometimes you get the public that will turn to the applicant and say, now tell me this. A little bit, it doesn't, again, I've lightened up over the years, and if the question was, how many acres is this? I don't know that we have to wait until afterwards, say it's 40, but by and large, we try to direct those questions. You honor the question, you say, I hear that, we're not going to answer it now, but I'm going to ask the applicant and the staff to note it down, and we'll address that. That's how to handle questions like that, in my opinion. Okay, let's see. We went through suggested rules. What testimony is admissible? Typically, you don't get this, but once in a while I've seen this here. There's really no limitation on the nature of the testimony. It can be really well related to the application and not very related at all. Again, the speaker has an idea in their mind of what's relevant. It may not be the idea you have, but it's the idea they have. And we don't censor testimony here unless it's extremely vulgar. We just don't do it because it's their opportunity to speak. It's your opportunity and it's your job to filter testimony. That's your job. And so if there's testimony that's way off the subject, you're the ones who are going to take that into account and give more weight to testimony that's on this topic versus testimony that's not. But there's no reason and no need to call that out and say, no, that's not about this hearing, because I've never seen a good outcome from that, because the speaker believes that they've got their 3 minutes and they think it's relevant, and you listen to it and you decide it's relevant. So the same thing is true for sort of hearsay. In a regular trial, you wouldn't have hearsay where, I'm presenting my case to Scott, and I said, well, Lauren has told me that it's a great car. She's not here, but she says it's a great car. That's hearsay, and it would not be admissible in a regular court. It's admissible here. But the judge is going to give a little less weight to repeated testimony from, all of my neighbors told me this, and I'm telling you. Well, maybe they did, maybe they didn't, or maybe they said it in a different way. So it's not that you didn't hear it, it's not it's relevant testimony, but you're probably going to give a little less weight to that than the live body here talking to you, and that's appropriate. It's your job. You do have to listen to consider all the testimony and all the witnesses, but don't let the number of people for or against decide your vote. That's the if you're really old, that's the applausometer. See, there are at least 3 or 4 people who know what an applausometer is, and if it gets up this far, then you get the washing machine. Remember, right? Okay. I know the staff coached me on this, but we ended up deciding that I could use the applausometer analogy, and I could also say the other analogy is Yelp reviews. So if you get the fact that there's 50 Yelp reviews in favor of the application and 10 against doesn't mean that you're voting yes. It means you've got 50 and 10, and you're making up your minds as a judge will based upon all the evidence. And sometimes you're making the decision based upon kind of who isn't, here. Very often you get witnesses that will stand up and say, nobody in this room is in favor of this, so therefore you must vote X, Y, or Z. That's the applausometer Yelp standard, and if that were true, we wouldn't need you, would we? We just have an applausometer measuring Yelp reviews, and we could save all this time. But your role is huge because you're filtering all this, and you're taking what you know about the community and applying it to the evidence that you get. So that's what I'm telling you about that. The applicant has rights as well that I want to mention. They have the right to make a presentation, a full one, to present multiple witnesses, and they've got the right to respond after the public comment. And occasionally that will be resisted because the public It's been limited to 3 minutes. Applicant did 15 minutes at the beginning. What's the applicant doing standing up again? And it's important, I think, probably for the chair to say at the beginning, here's how this is going down. We're going to have a presentation from the applicant, or excuse me, the staff, then the applicant, then we're going to take public testimony, and then we're going to ask the applicant and the staff if there's any response they need to make to the matters heard in public. People may or may not like that, but if they hear that rule at the beginning, they understand, okay, that's the rule, fair enough. I think it's important for the public to know that. It looks like the applicant's getting 2 bites. In a sense they are, but they're the applicant. And like in a trial, if I'm the plaintiff, I get 2 bites and the defendant only gets 1. That's how it is. But again, it's under the no surprises, tell people ahead of time what you're going to do, and I think that's better. Now let's talk about taking action. Well, the importance of findings and reasons for approval or denial. The case law that you see there is to the effect that, whatever you do has to have reasons and has to have a basis, because if it is appealed, and every couple of years there's a district court appeal of a land use case from Wheat Ridge, and I prosecute, I defend those appeals. And the role of the appellate judge is not to have a new trial and to have new witnesses, but the judge on a land use case reviews the record that you made and the planning and the city council made. And the evidence in that record either does or does not support the decision you made, but you don't have other evidence, you don't have a new trial. And so it's important when you make a decision to articulate why. And for me, it's important to articulate that the decision is based on the evidence and the relevant code sections. Usually the relevant code sections are the review criteria. If it's a rezoning, for example, there's 4 or 6 review criteria for rezoning. Changing conditions, and I'm sorry that I don't have them all in my head, but you know what they are. So it's important when you do end up taking action. Now we finished the hearing, now we're in action territory. You need to base the application on whether or not the application complies with the code under the evidence. Importantly, looking at letter C, not whether you as a commissioner like or don't like the project, or whether you think, importantly, that a different project would be better, or that, this is if you're doing subdivision, well, it's too dense. Well, is that the zoning that has been granted to this property? That's when the density decision got made. Subdivision isn't a density decision. It just isn't. It's a design of the density that's previously permitted decision. And I get it that often you'll get testimony and objections to a development, because I feel that way too. If my job is to oppose a development, I'm going to follow it all the way through the project. Through zoning, I'm going to follow it into subdivision. But we apply different standards at subdivision, so you need to make sure that your decision is based upon what the code requirements are, not your own personal, vision for that property. And I don't mean that to sound as if you don't have an important, your view about that property isn't important. It is, but you're taking evidence as the judge is about that property, and your decision has to be based upon that. The next thing actually talks about the separate research. So you just need to relate your decision against the criteria and the evidence, and the staff makes your job easier. There's always a staff motion, or always 2, really. There's and the recommended motion usually gives reasons and relates it back to the code. There's always room for you to go the other way, and there's always a draft motion the other way that says, okay, I move the other direction for the following reasons, and usually it's blank, and that's where you're going to have to fill it in. Tom Abbott at the Board of Adjustment was great at this. If you ever saw Tom Abbott operate in Board of Adjustment, he would listen to the evidence, he'd be making notes all the time, and then it would come time for him to make the motion, say, okay, I move to approve or deny, whatever it was, for the following reasons, and it was 5 minutes later, he had rattled through, a really good set of findings. Here, you don't have to be that detailed, because you've got a staff report that that allows you to have a basis for one motion, and you've got plenty of information in the staff report if the motion goes the other way to fill that in. Often, I've seen some denial motions where the staff report was for approval and you're going denial. I move to deny based upon lack of compliance with the comprehensive plan, impact on adjacent properties, the testimony of X, Y, and Z. And now what you've done is sort of a quick version of what Tom Abbott would do so well. And that gives me, as the person defending your action, a roadmap for that. And importantly, it gives the district court judge a roadmap. So just make sure that you think about the motion, and you're always welcome to add things to the motions that you're provided in your packet. And that's especially relevant when we talk about conditions, which we're going to get to in a minute. Can we talk about amendments to motions? Now we're sort of in the Roberts Rules kind of land. Council's in that land quite a bit. And I'd say that if there were council members here, but amendments to motions, especially here, where you might have conditions that you want to place on an approval that aren't already articulated in the staff report, because it kind of came up in the hearing. You didn't realize there was this issue, and the applicants volunteered some conditions. There's some other things going on, and you want to add that. Sometimes it works to have a motion to approve with following 3 conditions, which I've invented. But if 3 council members, if Scott, Janet, and Richard don't like that condition, but they like the second one, and you like the third one but not the first, if you have a motion that's got all of that in it, you're going to have trouble getting that motion passed, and it's confusing. Here's a trick, and I see it done all the time. And one person will say, well, now I'm going to make a base motion to approve, but I'm also going to encourage Janet and others to make individual motions to amend that motion by adding these conditions or dealing with it in some way. Think of it as a Christmas tree. You put the Christmas tree up, and then you add the ornaments one by one. And the votes on the ornaments can go up or down on the amendments, and then and that way the whole commission gets to see just the amendment and vote it that one up or down, and it doesn't kind of derail your work on the main motion where it's kind of complicated. If it's not complicated, then dynamite. Or if it's going to be an approval and there's just one condition, you're pretty sure it's going to fly, add it and try it out. But if it gets to be a real mess, that's the way to navigate your way out of that.
You can also, one other thing is you can also vote amendments individually. So a planning commissioner,
Sure, that's my suggestion. You take a main motion to approve, that's approve the project, no conditions, but you signal, look, it's really not no conditions. That motion is, we're going to take amendments to the motion. I move to amend the motion by adding this condition. Yes or no, you vote that. I move to amend the motion by adding this condition. Yes or no on that, it goes up or down, and then you go through that list. So it lets you vote on them separately. And however you get to that, you're allowed to do. And I think that's a good technique, yeah.
First,
No, you make the motion.
you make the
You
motion,
make the motion, then you take motions to
Okay.
amend the main motion.
each one.
Yeah, the main motion is your Christmas tree, your vehicle, and then you start putting things in it with amendments to that motion.
Based on whether or not each amendment,
Yeah, passes or fails. Each amendment to the main motion passes or fails. Any other amendments to this motion, says the chair? No, okay. We're going to return to the main motion, which has been amended in 3 ways by these votes we've been taking as follows. 1, 2, 3, all in favor of the main motion. And quite likely the main motion is going to pass because each of the amendments got a majority. Now you have every right to, to sabotage the process at the end and vote against a main motion that you helped structure, but you didn't hear me say that. But you have the right to do it. So there's that. I want to make a point about seeking the request before you. Remember who the applicant is. It's not you, right? The applicant's the property owner that came to you, and they, in their world, decided that they wanted to do this project, not some other project. not half of the project, not twice the project. That's their project. You can affect the project a little bit with conditions, but in the end, it's their ship. You don't have to like it. If you really don't want that project and there's a basis in the code for it, say no to it, as opposed to trying to basically rework the project on the dais. You know, there's a point at which amendments become you are the applicant and you're redesigning the entire project. And, you know, they made their decision about what they wanted, and it's not that you have to say yes. You can say no. If for whatever reason, you know, it just is not adding up, then you're recommending no on this, rather than trying to do a lot of surgery up there on the dais, because it isn't your body to have surgery on. That's the applicant's, to really mix metaphors. I'm sorry about that. Also, when you're speaking, I think when you're when you're deliberating, apply the same standards of relevance to your comments that you'd like to see out of the public. Now, the public is unrestricted, and I've said, you sit there and you listen. But, you know, as the judge, you want to make, yes, you know a lot of stuff about this other unrelated matter, and now the mic's on and there's this application. Leave that out. You're sticking with the application, because that's your job. That's what you signed up to do, and I think the public notices that. A couple of points here. Rezoning and comp plan amendments are the only time you're talking about land use and density. We talked about remember what's in front of you. If it's subdivision, you're not talking about land use and density, because the decision's already been made by a prior city council to say yes to that zoning, that land use, and yes to that amount of density on that property. What's in front of you is how that property gets divided up to service that use and density. And you can say yes or no to that application, but it needs to be about the subdivision process, not about whether it was the right land use or whether it was the right density. That was a decision that has been made, and we honor decisions that are made, and there are rules. And once that decision's made, the only way to unwind that decision is for there to be a rezoning of that property to something else. Yes, Vivian?
If we see in our packet that the applicant is not the owner, but the applicant is doing the presentation for the development,
Yep.
who really gets the legal standing on
Good question.
this?
Very common to have the applicant not be the owner, because in the development world, if the development approval isn't going to happen and I'm the developer buyer from Farmer Jones, to really make a stark comparison, the owner is not someone who's really in the development biz, owns the property. I'm the developer, I've got a contract. That contract usually is contingent on receiving the land use approvals, but it's very common, and the city requires this, and the staff can confirm this, but the city requires that the developer have the permission of the landowner, and that has to be written. I hereby give permission to developer X to make these applications on my behalf. And the development business in Wheat Ridge and elsewhere is, that I understand that, I'm not offended by that. In other words, it's the developers that are going to be going through all the land use review expense, and in the end, and some developers will just buy the property and take that risk. And fine, okay, now you're the developer and the owner, good for you. But you don't have to be. And because that's a matter of private contract, that's fine. But what we insist on is that whoever's making the application have the written consent of the property owner if they are not the property owner.
So if the development vote fails, then the property owner is still under the original zoning,
Sure?
and he can continue to
Sure.
sell the property to any other, and then it would come back to us as a new
Yep.
hearing.
Yep. And in that. Yeah. As a developer, I'll have an agreement to buy, and I don't have to close, unless the land use approval is granted. And that's typical and doesn't offend me. It's fine. It's how things work. But you're right. If If the project is denied, it's denied. And whoever owns that land is back to where they were before the application was filed. And actually, they were always there. They stay there until the application's approved, you know, when you think about it. So, but you're right, you will often get a developer, you go, are you the owner? It's fair to ask, but it's not a basis to say, no, well, I'm only gonna grant this if you're the owner, because it's not in the code. So it's, you know, rezoning and comp plan amendments, that's the only time we're doing land use and density. So and conversely, if it's a rezoning or subdivision case, especially rezoning, you're not engaging in site planning. And sometimes you're a little bit led down the garden path by developers on this. They're coming in for a rezoning, right? And there's all these pretty elevations of buildings and the landscaping. That's not in front of us. And they can't help often telling you all this about what this is going to look like. But we're not doing a site plan tonight. You know, what we're doing is zoning and density and use and density. And so you have to be in the position of saying, yeah, that's all great, but we're talking about whether this is an appropriate zone change from whatever, A1 to C2, and whether this density is appropriate, and that's what you're focusing on. Again, just like you have to kind of filter testimony you'll get from the public, you have to filter testimony you get from the applicant, because often they will tell you more because they want, they want you to say yes to the rezoning, and they think if these great pictures are up there, that will encourage you. It's not illegal for them to do that, but it's your job to filter through that. Scott?
But actually, I think the city, and this is speaking from direct experience, that I was working on a rezoning project in the city of Wheat Ridge, and the requirement from the planning staff was that we had to have a site plan in place. It wasn't as simple as just changing the zoning, and so we needed some rough architectural elevations, what the intended use was.
Yeah, so I want to address this because it goes back to one of the things I was talking about, the difference between a planned development and a mixed-use zoning. So when you rezone to a planned development, that is accompanied by an outline development plan, and there is a general graphic because it's a property-specific zoning. So you're committing to a general land use concept, a general circulation pattern, and certain land uses. So you will see some graphic. It's not the final landscape plan. It's not the final site plan. It's not the specific parking counts. It's the standards, mins, max, general idea. We see this issue a lot come up with a mixed-use zone change, and you know it's been what now almost 10 years since we've had mixed use, and I think you'll hear us say you'll have an applicant come in wants to rezone to MUN because they want to do live work. And we'll put a sentence in there that says the purpose of the zone change is because they want to do live work. And they're jazzed about their live work situation. So they'll come up and describe this long, live work. We'll approve the zone change, council approves the zone change. And sort of the opposite of the question you were asking, you will hear us say, for the record, this zone change is to MUN and would allow any of the permitted uses that are allowed in MUN or whatever other the straight zone district. So you've heard probably, we've heard a lot from a wide range of the community. The mixed use is sort of a bait and switch, right? The applicant was so excited about the swimming pool business they said they were going to do. You filtering, so you'll have to really filter, especially with mixed use zone changes. We don't require any site plans for those or any specific use in general. Folks that do have something in mind will be excited about it, will explain that to you, and we will continue to say, for the record, this is a zone change to a zone district that would allow more uses than just the one thing that this person's really excited about. So some you will see a site plan because a plan development mandates it, some you will not. And we will try to navigate you through those waters so that we can stay focused on what are you changing, what could it be, but what could it also be if they were to sell or go away or something like that happens.
Good distinction between plan development and straight zone district rezones. So thank you. We've already covered the fact the applicant's in charge of their application, I think more times than we need to, so I'll move right on. Grounds for denial, if you're going to say no. Adequate grounds for denial or anything in the applicable provisions of the code. So if you're going to say no, have reasons that emanate from the code, and you'll see those in the staff report because the staff report will always tell you, here's the applicable criteria here. The staff might say, we believe they're met. If you're going to make a motion to deny, look at the ones that are met and reverse them if you believe in that. In other words, if for whatever reason your take on it is that it's not a change in conditions, again, sticking with kind of rezone, then say that and say why. And that's, again, what you're doing is crafting your version of the evidence connected up with the code. And you don't have to do it like the staff would or I would, but sort of some signals in that motion will be very helpful to me then when I'm defending the case. Inappropriate grounds for denial or failure of the developer not to volunteer a condition that you couldn't independently require. And we're going to talk about conditions in a minute. Belief that it's the wrong use or density when the zoning's in place. It would really hurt me if that's the reason for denial that's on the record, and now I got to defend that to the district court judge. You know, that would make my job, you know, harder. We're flipping the page and we're almost done, or getting close. Failed motions, the rule is that if a motion to approve fails, then you have made no recommendation yet. That's unlike our Board of Adjustment, where if they don't get the requisite number of votes, it's automatically deemed a denial and we're off to the races. In Planning Commission world, if there's a failed motion or a tie motion, there's no recommendation yet, and so keep making motions. You know, if it fails, then it fails, you know, 5-3 or whatever. Those of you that are on the 5 side know kind of what motion you think might pass, because you think maybe you got the votes for it, but, you know, keep making motions until you've acted. Kind of our last major category here is conditions, exactions, and conditions of approval. I want to do 2 things. Sort of do a little case law short course around exactions and conditions, just because you'll hear that sometimes from the applicant's lawyer saying, you can't do that, that's, you know, or that's a regulatory taking, and I've got the right to the highest and best use of my property if I had a nickel for every time I've heard, you know, the land development community say that, and I want to debunk a little of that. And then we'll talk about some specific conditions that come up a lot that are relevant and that are allowed. But very often it's the conditions game. You know, it isn't just a yes, no. There's conditions, you know, and you'll find them in the staff report. And so what about that? What are commonly imposed conditions? Usually they relate to the site design or timing. Exactions are land dedication, park fees, facilities, things that you're exacting out of the developer that the public's going to own, right? Land dedication, parks, park fees, facilities. A condition is something you're requiring the developer to do that they're going to own. Storm drainage that's on site, okay? Streets, streets on private streets on site, streets dedicated to the city, you know, city owns. Snow storage was a big one when I used to represent Silverthorne. They always wanted to know where's the snow storage, and the developers never wanted to, because that's land they don't get to develop. You know, that's got to remain empty, so you can push all the snow from the parking lot onto that. So you just lost like a whole unit of density because of the snow storage requirements. That's a condition, not an exaction. And, you know, less important here, probably less important increasingly. A couple of big cases the Supreme Court has decided that are helpful to us. This Nolan versus California Coastal Commission. California Coastal Commission has authority for all development right along the coast. We're inland by some dimension I keep forgetting. And that's where you go to get your approvals, or one of them anyhow, not the local jurisdiction, but the California Coastal Commission. So the Nolans in 1982, or probably in 1980, had a little beach house, and they were not satisfied with that and wanted it to be sort of a McMansion, and so they scraped the beach, wanted to scrape the beach house, put in a big house, and they had to go to the California Coastal Commission to get approval for that. Coastal Commission said, well, that's fine, but we have a problem because people have trouble getting down to the beach, and the beach is public. And if you've ever driven Highway 1 along California coast, it's frustrating, isn't it? Because you want to get to the beach, but you're prevented by this kind of wall of houses and development and fences, and it's hard to get down to the beach. You can get to the public beaches, but the whole beach, you know, up to whatever high water line, I'm no water lawyer or a tide lawyer, but, you know, is public. You don't own it's public, but getting to it is the real problem. And so the California Coastal Commission said, well, no, there you go, very good. And the California Coastal Commission said, well, to solve that problem, we're going to make you, the Nolans, grant more of an easement parallel to the beach, down by the beach. And the Nolans said, okay, tell us how that addresses the announced problem. The announced problem was people getting down to the beach from the road. And you're saying the exaction you're imposing, condition you're imposing on us, is more land out of our property parallel to the beach. There's no, the term of art would be reasonable relationship between the exaction and a legitimate government interest. It's legitimate to get people to the beach. We get that. That's a legitimate government need, just like it's a legitimate thing for Wheat Ridge to require drainage for impervious cover and to require adequate street system to be built to connect up to a new development. But the condition you're requiring doesn't service that goal at all, does it? We think you just wanted more land along the beach, and this was your good chance, California Coastal Commission, to get that out of us. Supreme Court said that's exactly right. If you'd required of them a little path from Highway 1 down to the beach, yeah, that would have been a reasonable connection between your governmental interest and the thing you're requiring be done. So that's a standard that is applicable to you. It's not in our code, but it's case law that you kind of bear in mind. And so that sort of goes along with connecting up what you do with what the reason for it is, and failure of the connection in the Nolan case. And so that's the reasonable relationship between the condition and a government interest. The Dolan case, Florence Dolan owned the A-Boy Plumbing Supply shop in Tigard or Tigard. I've never known how to print. Is it Tigard? Thank you. Oregon. And so business was great, and she was expanding the A-Boy Plumbing Supply, where you go to get straight L's and other stuff to plumb a house. That's wonderful. So we're glad that and Tigard said, well, behind the shop was a drainage way and a trail, area for a trail along a drainage way. I think I'm getting the facts mostly right. And forgive me if I don't get quite on the money, but, artistic license, right? Okay.
We have recent grad school graduates.
Oh, God, no. They're really going to nail me.
Correct.
I have morphed the facts in these for a long time. But in any event, Tigard said, well, that's fine. You're increasing impervious cover because of larger whatever. And so our condition on this is going to be that you dedicate the entire drainage way behind to the city, behind the building, and that you build a trail. Bike trail. And so that went up on appeal, and the court said, well, yes, it's true that a larger, operation would increase the traffic to the operation, but what was required was not roughly proportional to the impact, because how many people go to plumbing supply on their bicycles? Not that many. So you're out of proportionality there. It's not roughly proportional, and especially on the impervious cover, that's drainage, and you wanted the title to the drainage way. That is also out of proportion, maybe an easement, but you want a title. And again, I probably wrecked the facts, but the point I'm making here is twofold. Under Nolan, there has to be a good relationship between what you're trying to get and a legitimate government purpose. Under Dolan, the connection is there, but it's out of proportion. And if we put it, say, in Wheat Ridge, and someone's expanding from a single family to a duplex, and we said, okay, you're going to need to widen that local street to 3 lanes. That would be connection to a governmental purpose, yes, traffic, more cars there, 2 more cars for the other unit. So the connection is there, but it's way out of proportion. Another lane, really, for those 2 cars. What's interesting is we spend a lot of time in this room, I think, legitimately arguing about, well, what's the right proportion here, don't we? Because we, very often the case will be, is the parking short and is there enough? And so we're actually having a Nolan versus Tigard conversation when we have that. And we should. All right.
And really, most of those, I think, often play out at a staff level. And we actually have Nolan Dolan. I'm not sure if you guys have experienced any arguments with our Public Works Department sometimes or with the Colorado Department of Transportation, because they'll often want to say, well, we'd like XYZ on Wadsworth or Kipling or any one of our state highways. And we have to go to them and say, well, but this project only generates 10 trips or something like that. Really, I mean, it's not constitutional to be able to ask for a new lane on your state highway just because they're adding 2,000 square feet on. So it really does play out in the real world, and hopefully before it gets to this body. But
I actually have seen in another municipality where a hotel was going up and the municipality wanted the developer to pay for a very expensive pedestrian enclosed bridge and then kept reducing the levels of the hotel. Finally, it just went away.
Yeah, because the impact was by definition less. Yep.
Yeah, I'm just curious, any relationship to a case we've recently covered is purely coincidental. If somebody's supposed to dedicate parkland in a development, and they dedicate a pocket park that is more like a postage stamp park, and are willing to pay the fee, does any of that sort of tie into these two cases? I mean, as a member of the Planning Commission, can I say, no, I don't think that's big enough?
Sure.
It's disproportional.
Yeah, I mean, that fact pattern checks appropriately the Nolan box, legitimate government purpose, and the tool used, money or land, addresses that, is a reasonable way to address that. So you check the Nolan box, and the question is, are you checking the Dolan box? Is it roughly proportional to the impact? Either way, and I think the point you're making is it's out of proportion because it's not enough.
Right.
And again, that's a judgment the government gets, the decision makers get to make. As they did in Dolan and sort of made it, I won't say guessed wrong, but their relationship for their own internal purpose or the whatever the decision makers, whatever motivated them to want more, they voted for that. Obviously, it's what's the right way to say this? It's a subjective determination up to the point where it kind of crosses a line, and in the Dolan case, it sort of crossed a line. I believe the courts give you a fair amount of latitude and respect the subjective judgments that you have to make. That's your job. And within a reasonable amount of latitude, while the court might have done it differently, and while any one of you individually might have thought it wasn't enough or was too much, the courts will generally uphold a decision that you make that has some support in the record, even though the court itself personally would have, or I would have said, that's not enough or it's too much. So I think where I'm headed with the answer is, it's your job to articulate that and see if you get the votes. And other people, that's, again, another reason I think why it's good to have multiple members on the commission. You're going to feel somewhat differently sometimes. And you make your best case. And I have seen councils and planning commissions in this room take a minority position and argue it convincingly enough that by the time, doggone it, it comes down to voting, there's enough votes for it. Vance Edwards was very good with that. He hung in the pocket on stuff and would take something from a 2-6 to a 5-3 and get it done by virtue of, and I'm not saying you should, torture the group endlessly, and Vance didn't do that either, but he was convincing, and even though he recognized that maybe he didn't have the votes now, he kind of kept pressing, but in the end, you've got to get others to support you in the view that it isn't enough. Well, let's look at some.
I had one quick.
Sure,
one
yep.
to that. So the two most common exactions we get from a land standpoint are streets and parks. And so we're usually looking at the collective exaction, so the total acres of streets and parks, which is sometimes why the streets may get the priority in terms of land area that's dedicated. And then the alternatives for both dedication of land of streets and parks that we routinely see are fees in lieu of parks and also fees for streetscape. So we actually changed our streetscape requirements because of a rough proportionality issue where we had a single-family home on an arterial, and they would have had to build another lane and a bike lane and a sidewalk, and it was just a single-family home. So we've tried to apply some of these techniques through an impact fee study that went through to council or was adopted by resolution when we made those calculations to hopefully ensure that the calculation is inherently already meeting the Nolan and Dolan tests. That's not to say we get it right every time, but that's generally the homework that we've done sort of on the back end.
Labor the point, but similarly, our parkland dedication fees are very data-driven. I mean, they're based on estimated population, kind of national ratios for how much parkland should be provided for a certain number of people. And then we went and we did a land valuation study to determine what kind of a reasonable average land cost if the city were to have to go out and actually acquire that amount of land. So in my opinion, it's very defensible.
Couple of points, and then we're to some questions and might get out early, and that'd be all right. Occasionally you'll say, well, I've got the right to the highest and best use of my property. And if you put this condition on, I won't get the highest and best use is X, Y, or Z. And the case law is really clear in Colorado. It's simply not true. If that were true, we wouldn't bother with zoning, would we? If everyone can take it to the max, then we wouldn't have a need for you, we wouldn't have a need for this conversation. You don't have the right to the highest and best use. You've got the right to a reasonable economic use, which very often is less than something that you could make more money on. It's just the case. What the government doesn't have the right to do is take a property that's more or less residential and say, we're going to downzone that to open space, because that's not an economic use at all in that context. And the cases where governments have tried to overreach and sort of get a park for free, that's like, okay, we're going to downzone you to private open space, and now you got a park for free. You don't own it as the government, but that's where you get in trouble. But if you hear the highest and best use, I've got the right to it, it's simply not true. And in Wheat Ridge, there's no property that's got zoning here in the city that, as a result of that zoning, doesn't already have a reasonable economic use. It's just the case, so if you hear that, that's something you can discount. Well, what are some conditions that are acceptable that you can put on? The standard review is, again, tie it to a provision in the code. We've already mentioned land dedication requirements, perfectly fine. Corrections to the plat would be if you're in subdivision land. It seems minor, but the plat's going to be there forever, and if the roadway's in the wrong place, then that's a perfectly fine condition. Conditions that support the technical requirements of the chapter, drainage easements, we talked about that. Requirements for maintenance of common elements. Often, we'll require, the city staff will require as a condition of approval on something that's got common elements that we need an HOA on this. And we arm wrestle with developers on that a little bit. But I'm, always play the videotape forward. The developer will be here today and tomorrow, and that's no pejorative. But then they sell the property, and it's also no pejorative to say that they're allowed to move on. I'm fine with it. That is our system. It's capitalism. I believe in it. But if 10 years from now and the detention pond is silting up, who's going to pay for that? And what's the system for that? And so it's appropriate to play the videotape forward a little bit and make sure that there are conditions in place that support the facilities that are being put on the development to service that development. So there's that. Preservation of trees and vegetation, existing trees, and also conditions to require that landscaping that's installed lives. It's very common to have conditions of a year, 2 years after planting to make sure all the trees that got jammed in, that came from Home Depot right at the end of the planting season and they were sort of green, live. And we have requirements for that and often bond even for that. Traffic patterns is viable, and that's something that's discussed quite a bit here in this room. Conditions offered by the applicant, I want to make a specific point about this. Applicants will often say, I'm willing to do this. Your code doesn't require it, but I'm going to do it. Fine. If they offer it, you can then fold that into your motion and make it a condition. What you can't do is say, well, our code doesn't require this, Mr. Applicant, but how would you feel about doing this? Something that's not required. And that is not appropriate. And why? You're asking the applicant, well, if you pay us this, to make it really crass, we'll give you our approval, or it can look like that. People don't get to buy approvals from the government. You can offer a condition that, as a developer, that the government wouldn't otherwise be able to require, but you can't require as the government a condition that you don't have a basis for in return. Take them up on their offer, and that's fine, but you can't turn it around and say, well, this is all good, but we need this, even though we can't otherwise require it, but we got you in front of us now, and now's our chance. And it's a little like the CDOT, the extra lanes example that Ken mentioned. I'm on the last page. Okay. Conditions not permitted, and we've kind of covered some of this. Density restrictions if you're at site plan, matters outside the scope of the chapter, conditions that don't have a code basis, conditions that actually rework the application. The last point I guess would make is we've got a lot of very good technical staff here, and they're here to review especially things like drainage plans, traffic, and trust them. And if you have questions, though, ask them ahead of time. And I will tell you, as a staff member myself, we're all really grateful for that because it lets us do a better job of answering the question for you. A question that I get from a council member by email the day before the hearing is a whole lot better answered by me than the same question from that council member when I'm sitting at the desk here having to furiously riffle through the code book. And I just have a lot more confidence in my answer if I have a little, if I have time. If that's when it comes up, it came up in the hearing, you had no advanced knowledge that you'd have that question, then you ask. I'm not saying you don't ask in the hearing. If it comes up, you absolutely should ask if you've got a question. It's our job to be, as ready as we possibly can. Where you can help us be ready, do that. We appreciate your final questions. This would be a rare opportunity to get out sooner than promised. Yes, Vivian.
City council gets the same list of quasi-judicial that we do. And so, where was I going with that? So I guess they're just under the same requirements that we just listed through too. There's nothing different about them than us.
Nothing different about, because they act in a quasi-judicial manner as well. Mm-hmm. And and I tell them that, and I make the distinction for them that they do more legislation than you do, because you review ordinances that amend Chapter 26. They do ordinances that amend the whole code book, and so they're more commonly doing things that are not quasi-judicial. So they're more commonly doing legislative work, which means all those rules are thrown out and they can get calls in the middle of the night and talk to people in the vegetable aisle as long as they want on a proposed ordinance to change the leash law or the doggy daycare. And so I make the point with them a lot. You've got to bear in mind which hat you're wearing when you're having the conversation. And for them, they have a lot more legislative conversations, so they're used to not being worried about those ex parte rules. And so they have to be, I think, to some extent, more on guard. For you, you're more often doing things that are quasi-judicial, and so the default for you is probably that. The default for them isn't that, because they have, they're elected representatives. As politically elected representatives, I think they have a strong personal obligation, which I absolutely support, that they need to be available to their constituents. I really believe in that. If you're going to put your name on the ballot and get elected, part of that job is that you're available to people, and you can't just not answer the phone. And they don't. They're all good about that, and I think That's why they're in that biz, and they don't mind that, and they like that. But they have to, maybe I'm not answering the question you're
No,
asking,
you
but I think they have a greater challenge because their default is probably that they can talk to people. And, oh, wait, that's a quasi-judicial. But, you know, in all their council action forms, you'll notice there's a box, and it's in yours too, that says whether it's quasi-judicial or not. Often you don't get a lot of action out of the public until something's really scheduled for a hearing. Then notices have been going out, and that's when the phone calls start coming in, the emails. And that's why we have the box on the memo that is the cover sheet to your packets, and always look at that right away. Most of the time, that quasi-judicial box is going to be checked for you. At least half of the time, it's not checked for them, and so they have to kind of, you know, navigate through that.
Just one last question. I was at the council meeting on April 8th, so if it comes back to us, I'll recuse myself. That situation seemed like a good go-over as a learning, as a teaching experience, and that could go quite lengthy. I don't know if this is the place to talk about it or not, but I had a lot of questions as far as quasi-judicial that came up with that, so I don't know how staff or anybody cares about questions or
That
not.
hearing was a real, it was not exactly a master's class, but, you know, it was just a whole series of questions came up. It was, you know, we covered a lot of territory, a lot of navigating our way through that. You know, we have a separate charter provision that we spent a lot of time talking about whether or not your former member, Amanda Weaver, could participate. And so we had to navigate through that. There's a charter provision that, you know, says what it says, and I believe in the charter. And if the votes are such that the charter requires an outcome, then by God, that's what we do. In that particular case, it was not something I recommended, but I also told them charter applies, and you're going to need to vote, and we'll respect the vote. Were there particular quasi-judicial questions around the quasi-judicial ex parte rules that you wanted to? What I'd rather not do is say, here's what happened in that meeting, you know, only because we're, you know, that's some of that is still out there, and per my earlier statement, put it this way, there's plenty of other ways for us in a training session to talk about the ex parte and quasi-judicial rules than to use a case that is not complete, and I'd rather not. But I'll answer any questions so long as it's not, well, here's what happened there and why. You know, once it's really done, we can do a post-mortem. And by post-mortem, I meant after it's over. That's what I meant.
Debrief.
I really appreciate, as we all do, your attention, and again, I'll come back to what I said at the beginning, the time you spend happily and with dignity up here, because, you know, it's a tough job, and I really appreciate what you're doing for the city. You know how to reach me. If you don't, you can get to me through the staff, and I'm available to you as I am available to the council. And you know, I'm happy to answer questions. Council will call me up. They'll email me, and I'll give answers. If it's something that is real simple, I'll just direct it to a council member. I'm pretty careful to share questions I get with everyone because I represent the council as a whole. I'm not their individual personal lawyers. I'm the lawyer for the council. I'm the lawyer for the planning commission. So don't ask me a question that you're not okay with me sharing the answer with everyone, just as a heads up. And I tell the council the same thing. Thank you all.
But citizens of the city don't get to use you as an attorney in case of
No,
questions.
and I try to be as polite as I can about that. And often I'll once or twice a month, I'll get a question from a citizen who in their head, you're the city attorney, I'm a resident of the city, you need to answer this. And I'm not their attorney. In fact, I can't give them legal advice. I do several things. If it's a charter section, whatever, covers that, I'm not real precious about it. I'll tell them that. And if it's a question that can be better answered by a staff member I'll direct them to staff member, to a council member, to city manager. And if it's pure legal advice, I want to engage in this to be able to unwind something that council's done. I'll have to, I have to tell them, I'm not your lawyer for that. You're going to have to get other counsel. I've never, very rarely is someone upset when I try to politely explain what my actual role is, because usually they're not completely aware of what it is. So that's how I handle those questions. I don't just brush them off, I'm not your lawyer, you're out of here. Because nobody likes that kind of answer, and you don't have to give that kind of answer and still honor the rules that apply to you. And so I try hard to direct them to someone that has the ability to give them an answer. Well, thank you all. Safe ride home. Is it going to snow tomorrow? No? I hope not. Sunday, okay.
Thank you. We don't have to make motions during study session, so as long as there's consensus to adjourn, then we can do that. Yes, thanks.
Sorry.